Thanks for coming tonight. I appreciate the nice crowd here. I have a hunch some of you are coming to see Congressman here, but that's okay. I'll get a few sentences in before that. Now, the reason I wrote this book, Recarving Rushmore, was because I felt that the way historians, political scientists, journalists, and even the public evaluated presidential success was off kilter. I didn't go around in musty archives trying to unearth startling new historical information about this president or that president. What I did was I took existing sources and I just tried to think about it in a different way, that is, reanalyze it from a different perspective. Now, although the book is about the presidents, it is really an alternative history of the United States. So I thought tonight, you know, we all in Washington, we go to lectures and we hear the speaker speak and then we all get up and ask questions. I thought it'd be interesting if I asked the audience some questions first, kind of reversing the role here. So I'm going to give you a little quiz. I'm going to take a baseline first, then I'll get into the presidents. I have some questions first. The first one is, what happened on July 4th, 1776? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? I don't hear any. Oh, guess you didn't learn that in school, huh? Anybody have a guess? Okay. Okay, question number 2. Who did the first powered controlled flight? Anybody got any ideas? Okay. And who was the first person to fly across the Atlantic? Okay. Now, when I was in college, I volunteered for psychological experiments, and when you go in, they basically trick you because you think you're doing one thing and then you're really doing another thing. That wasn't the baseline, that was the quiz, and you all flunked because those answers unbelievably are wrong. The Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th. The vote for independence was on July 2nd. Nothing major really happened on July 4th, and John Adams said that he wrote that July 2nd would always be our Independence Day. Well, he was wrong. Okay, now I'm going to go through these quick because I really do want to get on to the presidents, but I have a point in doing this. Okay, the second one, what was my second question? Oh yeah, the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers were not the first people to fly under controlled powered flight. There was a guy named Gustav Whitehead who did it 2 years before, and while the Wright brothers were getting a few hundred yards, 832 yards I think, or 800 and some yards in their plane, he took a flight 7 miles. And he did it 2 years before the Wright brothers. And the reason that he didn't get the fame, there were 2 reasons. The first one, nobody took a photograph. The famous photograph got in all the school kids' history books. And the Smithsonian for years refused, they wanted the Wright brothers plane because it became so famous. But they refused to put the fathers of flight because they knew it wasn't really true. Until the family said, well, you're not getting the plane unless you put that on there. So they did. And the second reason he didn't get any credit was because he was a German immigrant, and if you recall, we were leading up to World War I at the time, and German immigrants were not too fondly regarded at the time. Okay, the third one, Charles Lindbergh, he was probably the 82nd person to fly across the Atlantic. No, I'm not kidding. But it's hard to say because there were various crews and various aircraft that did it, but he was not the first. Many more people did it. The reason he became famous is because people in Paris listened to all the tribulations that he had on his trip, and so they all rushed out to the field, and he was really shocked when he landed at all these people. He had made were making such an issue of that he landed, and they picked him up and carried him around, and of course he became famous. But of course, now the reason I mention these 3 events is not because they have anything to do with presidents. It's because what you think you read in your history books in high school and college may not be true, and then some of the stuff that is true, they've left out some things. So I just want you to think about that while I go into this, because my ratings of presidents are much different than the ratings of conservatives and liberals, which, although there are some differences, they seem to be coalescing around some agreement, actually, on those, even on presidents like Reagan. But it's not really because that I think they're right. Everyone thought the world was flat until they figured out it wasn't. Some guy did it, and he's figured out it wasn't, right? So groupthink is not necessarily correct. And I believe that both parties now, and both the left and the right in the United States, have the bias of they like activist big government, both at home and abroad, with noted exceptions sitting to my left. So I wrote this book saying, well, let's just look at the policies. Let's not look at charisma, which many historians, they wouldn't consciously say they fall victim to charisma, but they take it into account, I think. Otherwise, why would Teddy Roosevelt get so much play? William McKinley, his predecessor, was a much more important president than Teddy Roosevelt. They also love activism. An active president who's bold and that sort of thing. But is that always the way to the right policy? David was just talking about how the presidency has gone into an imperial mode, and maybe now with Bush even into a hyper-imperial mode. Is this the way we want to go? What about the way the founders envisioned the system was that the Congress would be the primary first among equals in the government. Article 1 is not the executive branch, it's the congressional branch. The Constitution specifies in great deal what the Congress's powers were. In Article 2, it's very vague. And of course, unfortunately, the presidents have filled that void with many actions that were probably unconstitutional. So now, I try to get rid of the charisma bias. I try to get rid of the activism bias. We like presidents who can give a great speech. We have all heard speeches by Roosevelt and Kennedy, who I don't think were that good of presidents. Maybe we can go into that later. But we love presidents who can turn a good phrase, or at least their speechwriters like Theo Sorensen can turn a good phrase, and the president can deliver the speech in a good way. And lastly, historians are biased because they love presidents who serve in a war or during a crisis. Even if the president contributed to the crisis, didn't prevent the crisis, made it worse, or caused the crisis in the first place. And we have many instances of that in American history, I think. Now, my problem with some of the other analysis is that they assume the posture of the neutral observer. And none of this is neutral because everyone looks back on history with their current policy views. I'm no different, but I'll tell you what my policy views are. You have to dig around to figure out what the other policy views of other people are. Not everyone, but an example of this is they use the effectiveness criterion. Now, I term it presidential success, not effectiveness, because I want to focus on not whether the president was able to implement his agenda and how effective he was doing that. Because if you take that to the extreme, if Lenin, Stalin, and Mao were presidents of the United States, they would have been very effective. They should be 1, 2, and 3, right? They did what they wanted to do. So, of course, policy does matter. Policy, what they do does matter, and I say that's what we ought to concentrate on. It doesn't matter that Bush is not a good orator or he can't put a sentence together. Probably doesn't matter. The policy is what matters, and that's what we need to concentrate on. And I think we haven't really done that very well, and I try to do that. So I've noted all these biases, and so I basically, how did I evaluate the presidents? I evaluated them on the basis of whether they upheld the Constitution, meaning a limited role for the presidency. I also evaluated them on whether their policies promoted peace, prosperity, and liberty. And I think we can all agree on those goals, but how do we get there, right? Well, in my view, a limited, read small government with a restrained executive and a Congress that was first among equals compared to the other two branches is the ideal. That's a republic. And we saw what happened to Rome as power went from the assembly to the Senate, to the dictator, to the emperor. And I'm afraid we're on the slow road to that. And it's sort of like the frog who jumps in the bathtub because it's not cold, and they gradually put up the temperature of the water so that he doesn't know it, and eventually he's dead. And unfortunately, we don't have dictators that just come in and take power. Over time, through U.S. history, the president has accrued more and more power.